So we're going to start the session today with a very important plenary because it's about the future of our oceans. We have 4 early career professionals who are not just primed to do great things someday, they're doing them today. We named this panel after Margaret Davidson. She's a very special person in the field. Margaret was one of the most respected visionaries for our ocean. She passed away in 2017. I remember Margaret very fondly. I was one of those young career professionals who she aided early in my career. And I know one thing is that she was an incredible trailblazer and left the world a better place than she found it. Margaret was a committed mentor for young professionals in the field and always made time to encourage the next generation of leaders. She's a very appropriate namesake for this session. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of the strongest ocean champions that we have on Capitol Hill. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island devotes much of his time speaking out about the urgent need to address climate change and to protect our oceans for the peoples and the economies that rely on them. He founded the Senate Ocean Caucus for just this reason, to promote creative, bipartisan solutions for the challenges facing the ocean. Please join me in welcoming Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here for the early session. I hope you're adequately caffeinated and ready for another great day of CHOW. It is always exciting for us in Congress when Capitol Hill Oceans Week comes to town and brings the energy and the focus that we need on our oceans. I am here to bring a very brief message of optimism and encouragement. Clearly, we have very dire problems in our oceans. As a scientist recently said, the ocean is screaming, and we have not been very good at listening to the screams of the ocean. You being here helps translate the ocean message to us in Capitol Hill, and I appreciate that. But what I want to say is that I believe there's an open door for bipartisan action on Capitol Hill. And I don't believe that just because I'm an optimist. I believe that based on experience. When I started the Senate Oceans Caucus with my terrific colleague, Senator Murkowski from Alaska, we grew it to over 40 members, and it is virtually evenly bipartisan. It is not what we call a letterhead caucus, where everybody puts their name on a letterhead and that's the end of the job. We have been busily working to get things done. We've cleared 4 international fishing treaties. We did it actually in an afternoon after a lot of legwork to get everybody ready for that. You had to go back 9 years to find the previous 4 treaties that the Senate had cleared. So to do 4 in an afternoon was an exciting moment. We then passed by unanimous consent, with everyone in agreement in the Senate, the Port States Measures Treaty that lit up those fisheries agreements, those treaties. We then went on and with an outstanding colleague, Dan Sullivan, also of Alaska, went to work on marine plastic debris. And we passed the first marine plastics legislation that Congress has ever done. And we did so, again, in bipartisan fashion. We passed it by unanimous consent on the Senate floor, and it is now law. We then went on and with Senator Murkowski put together an ocean data monitoring bill that is out there now. It's called the Blue Globe Bill, and if you want to have a look and comment on it, please feel free to do so. It is the biggest piece of work we have done yet. And we hope and expect that we'll be able to bring it home because of a lot of work that's been done leading up to it, so that it too will pass the Senate by unanimous consent. And the good news about our marine plastics bill, although it was the first, it was not very much. It was more in the nature of a beachhead than a victory. But Dan Sullivan had such a good time doing it and got such good feedback that he came to me immediately after it passed and said, we've got to do a bigger, better bill. And so we will shortly be dropping SOS 2.0, a bigger, better marine plastics bill, and we hope to continue stepping up our congressional effort. So where the oceans are, there is bipartisan interest. And as long as we do our homework and do the legwork to get everybody together and to make sure people know what's coming and to not burden them with surprises, what I have found is that bill after bill after bill, treaty after treaty, we can pass in the United States Senate unanimously. That is something worth celebrating. And I hope that that gives all of you a target and some confidence, and in particular the confidence to raise your aspirations a little bit and task us in the Senate to do still more. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Senator Whitehouse. It's always an honor to have you speaking at CHOW. Next, I'd like to introduce Congressman Scott Peters of California, another great champion for our oceans. The congressman is a staunch advocate for the environment and the ocean. Representing San Diego, he knows how reliant our economy is on a clean, sustainable, and healthy ocean. The congressman is the chair of the Democratic Caucus Climate Task Force, promoting clean energy, domestic manufacturing, and the development of renewable energy resources. Please join me in welcoming the congressman.
Good morning. Thanks for having me today. Thanks to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for hosting the 19th annual Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and it's great to see this enthusiasm for climate leadership and for ocean protection. And special greetings to my hometown champion, Margaret Leinen of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who's moderating this morning's panel of early career leaders. And I also am informed that the scuba nuts are here. There are future leaders too, so thank you all for being here. This is a particularly essential topic and conference this year. I don't need to tell this community how about the warnings, the devastating UN reports that demonstrate how climate change will have catastrophic consequences on biodiversity, both on the land and in the water. Our current administration is dismantling programs that combat climate change. They're underfunding other programs that gather much-needed data on the severity of the crisis. But more than 1 billion people rely on food from the ocean as their primary source of protein. Without significant changes to carbon dioxide emissions, the ocean could be 150% more acidic in 2100 than it is today. And I think, as the senator suggested, the ocean is a carbon sink that's being abused. We have to act now to get our oceans to prevent them from getting hotter. Last summer, we were alarmed when UC Scripps Pier, UC San Diego Scripps Pier, measured the sea surface temperature at 78.6 degrees, the highest reading in the pier's 102-year history. Good news, today, to this very day, after I leave here, I'm going to vote on 4 bills to combat ocean acidification, which we will pass. And I told Senator Whitehouse he's responsible for getting the Senate to pass them as well, including my friend Derek Kilmer's bill that creates prizes for innovation related to dealing with ocean acidification. So we're trying to be on the job in the House. I appreciate you being on the job on the ground, and we're going to work to get more support from the Senate, and we're hopeful about these bills. We're also on the cusp of providing more funding for long-term ocean research and monitoring. Now, we can't wait for a single solution to solve the climate crisis, both on the mitigation side or the adaptation side. So I want to refer you to something that we've aggregated. We call it the Climate Playbook. It is a collection of bills that both Republicans and Democrats have introduced over the past 2 terms that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow or even reverse the effects of climate change. I invite you as ocean leaders to check it out, offer suggestions, and to make us a partner in your efforts. I want to congratulate the Margaret Davidson emerging leaders who are awesome. I met them backstage. You're going to get to hear from them. Their diverse and innovative efforts are already proving invaluable. And I want to thank each of you for your commitment to dealing with the oceans and protecting the oceans. It's really important for you. I know many of you travel from other places. It's important for you to show up in Washington, D.C. and put a face to the name reach out to the lawmakers and let them know that this is important to you. They will respond to people from home, to your leadership, and to science that you support. So thank you for being here, and let's all keep hard at work to preserve and protect the oceans. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you again, Congressman. We really appreciate it. So I also do want to call out the scuba nuts in the front row here. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you have an opportunity, take some time to talk with these amazing young people who are our next generation of leaders. And we just appreciate all the work you guys do and that you keep coming back every year. We really love it. So thank you so much. I'd like to invite our moderator, Margaret Leinen, to join us. Margaret is the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She has extensive experience nationally and internationally in ocean science, global climate change, and environmental issues. She's also a researcher in paleoceanography and paleoclimatology. And I know Margaret will be sharing a lot about her stories also working with Margaret Davidson. So please join me in welcoming Margaret and the panel to the stage.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, especially to do this session in honor of Margaret Davidson. How many of you out there met Margaret at some time? A few. Margaret would have loved, well, she came to CHOW all the time, but she would have loved being in a session of emerging leaders in marine science and conservation in the allied fields that help us out with our messages. She started out with a JD. She was a lawyer, and she got her degree from Louisiana State. And then she went on to get a Master's of Marine Affairs from University of Rhode Island, and that's when I met Margaret. When she realized that the law could be a really powerful tool for her, and whereas most lawyers spend their entire career learning to edit their remarks, show great restraint, be very, show great decorum, Margaret was exactly the opposite. She was entirely irreverent. She was a natural wit. She was bold. She spoke out. She said what she thought all the time. And it was wonderful to watch her move through her career doing that and seeing people react to this really authentic person. After her degree in marine affairs, she became the director of South Carolina Sea Grant. And she shook things up not only at South Carolina Sea Grant, but also Sea Grant in general. And while she was there, she attracted the attention of the junior senator from South Carolina, Fritz Hollings. Remember, the senior senator was Strom Thurmond. So even in his 70s, Fritz Hollings was the junior senator. And together, they really formed this idea of having a coastal services center that focused on coastal management for the whole country, but of course having it in South Carolina. And that resulted in Margaret being the first director of that center. She then became, it later merged with another NOAA center, and she became the senior leader for coastal inundation and resilience. We all just knew Margaret as the person who really made everything coastal work in NOAA. When I came to Washington in 2000, she was the acting administrator, assistant administrator for NOAA's National Ocean Service. And NOAA tried to bring her into senior management several times, and she was acting this and acting that at a senior level. But she really preferred to be another level down so that she could be a goad to get things done faster, move the agenda more quickly. She was an enormous connector for all of us in the ocean science community. She knew everybody, and she was always connecting us. When I came to DC, she observed that there were a lot of Margarets around. So there was me, there was her, there was Margaret Spring, who at the time was the senior counsel for Senate Commerce, Transportation, and Science. There was Margaret Kaminsky, who was major staffer for Senator Inouye. There was Margaret Hayes over in Department of State. There was Margaret Kavanaugh, who was the Deputy Assistant Director of Geoscience at NSF. And then there were the Marys. There was Mary Glacken at National Weather Service, Mary Clutter, head of biology at NSF, and this soon turned into a group that got to be known as the M&Ms, the Marys and the Margarets. And we used to get together, we would say we had tea, but it was usually at 5 o'clock, and it usually came in a glass with a stem. She really was a connector she really made marine stuff go in DC. I want to tell you one other story, which is really so typically Margaret. She loved Hawaii. Kalani, she adored Hawaii. And she made sure that she made it there at least once a year. One of my favorite experiences with her there was that she got me signed up as a researcher with a group that was doing research on humpback whale acoustics, and we actually got to go out with them and snorkel around the humpbacks off Maui, which is an amazing experience. As the idea emerged for this wonderful Northwest Hawaiian Islands sanctuary, she really wanted to see this happen. And so she got Jim Connaughton, who was the head of CEQ at the time, and he was an avid diver. And she got him out to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands with a photographer. So they took hundreds of pictures. And at a meeting that she was in, which she described to me as a boring administrative meeting with Jim Connaughton and the Vice President, Dick Cheney, when the Marine Sanctuary was under consideration but seeing a lot of roadblocks, she had this pack of photos in her papers, and she just started passing it to Jim, who then passed it to the Vice President. And this went on throughout this entire boring meeting. And at the end, the Vice President said, "Okay, I give up. Where is this?" And she said, "Well, Leinen, I told him that that was going to be one of his legacies if he convinced the president to make that into a national marine sanctuary." And so George Bush signed the declaration for Papahana Mokuakea to become a national monument in 2006. Margaret never took credit for much, but she said, a few pictures here and there makes a difference in DC. And that's why we all loved her so much. Like I said, she would have loved being here with all of you and with these emerging voices and emerging leadership in marine science and in coastal issues and marine sanctuaries. So I'm going to stop and let them have a chance to talk with you. And first up is Desiree Tommasi, who is a project scientist with NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Santa Cruz and spends time in La Jolla as well. And she has You have some of this in your materials, but I want to highlight that she did most of her training, her bachelor's, master's, and PhD in Canada, with her PhD in oceanography from British Columbia. And she works on the effects of climate change and climate variability on marine ecosystems and how to apply that understanding to support fisheries management decisions. Desiree.
Thank you, Margaret. So, it's a pleasure being here and an honor to be on this panel with all of you as well. And I want to thank the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation and all the organizers for having me here. So one of my hats is also one of the National Climate Assessment authors. And so I'm going to pick up the theme that was talked about during the opening plenary this week, yesterday, and on the effects of climate change on our ocean ecosystems. So thanks. You could pass me the slides. So we know that our oceans are important for the many services that they provide to us, and the most obvious ones being for food and for jobs, and jobs in the fishing industry, in aquaculture, or in the tourism industry. But there are also other services that are less quantifiable, but just as important. And for some communities, their well-being is intrinsically linked to the oceans. And so Kalani here can talk a lot more eloquently than can I on those cultural values that the oceans provide. So what we show in the National Climate Assessment is that these services in our ocean ecosystems are at risks and are being impacted by ocean warming, deoxygenation, and ocean acidification. And here, next, oops. I just put the effects on one of these services, so fisheries catches. And so you can see here a map of North America, and the color reflects the changes that are projected in fisheries catches for the future, so 2041 to 2060, relative to 1991 to 2010, under the high emission scenario of RCP 8.5. And so any region that is yellow to red is going to show a decline in fisheries catch. And you can see that the hardest hit areas are actually the tropical regions. And this is because the species are moving to more optimal condition. In some areas, they're not being replaced by new species moving in. And I want to also stress that this is only talking about changes in sort of total fish biomass, but there's going to be changes in species composition that are also going to affect the communities that depend on the oceans. And so now what I wanted to do was also move the conversation to finding solutions for the changes that we know are going to come. Because even if we reduce emission, that's definitely going to reduce some of these drastic changes that we are projecting, but some of them will be unavoidable given how much CO2 is already in the atmosphere. And so in talking to stakeholders, I think as humans, we often think that we are resilient to change. And while we say we have adapted in the past, perhaps we can adapt again. But as I think Andy brought up in the opening plenary yesterday, past experience is not going to be as valuable to figure out how we can adapt to climate change because we're going to encounter novel conditions. And that was apparent in some of the effects of recent extreme marine heat waves and ocean warming events that we've seen in recent years, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast of the United States. And so I wanted to highlight some of the news headlines that sort of exemplify how climate variability and change can affect ocean communities. And so this is from the New York Times in 2012, and in the Gulf of Maine, 2012, water temperatures were very high early in the season, and that led to the lobster, changing their spawning phenology or the timing when they were coming into shore to spawn, and so they were available to the fishers earlier in the season, and that was no problem. They went out and got a lot of lobster. the problem was that the supply chain was not ready to receive that big influx of lobster early in the season. They needed to get their, the processors open, their labor in place. And so once they were open, there were so many lobsters on the market that the price went down to a 40-year low. And on the other side of the coast, in 2014 to 2016, we saw the blob, and so really high temperature that affected the North Pacific, and in particular the West Coast in 2015, 2016. And that had serious consequences for fishing community and also for protected species. So in 2015, there was a really large and prolonged toxic algal bloom that caused mass mortality events for sea lions, for instance, but also caused the closure of the Dungeness crab fishery and the shellfish fisheries. And those are some of the most valuable on the West Coast and caused billions of dollars in losses to the industry. And there were other unexpected consequences. So the crab fishery is a winter fishery, and so they couldn't fish in winter because of the toxic algal bloom. But then they fished in the spring of 2016 when the fishery reopened. And usually the effort at that time of year is really low, but not in 2016. Unfortunately, that is also the time when whales are migrating up from their breeding grounds up to their feeding grounds in Alaska. And so 2016 was a year where we saw a lot of whale entanglements. And so again, sort of unexpected consequences of some changes in ocean conditions and ocean variability. And then finally, on the West Coast as well, I want to highlight that we're not talking just about ocean warming, but changes in pH are also important, especially for shellfish. So on the West Coast, we've seen an increase of events where low pH waters are being brought up onto the shelf. And particularly for baby oysters, those pH concentration can be quite lethal. So baby oysters are more sensitive to changes in pH than the adult ones. And so much so that some oyster hatchery operation had to relocate to Hawaii, in this case, to find waters that were more conducive to growing larval oysters. And so in my work, I try to figure out, okay, what can we do to improve the resilience of fishing communities to climate variability and change? And so I look at the range of decisions that are being made in fisheries. And my focus has been so far mostly on fisheries management decisions, so when to set time era closures and catch limits, or what catch limits to set. But there is other industries that are actually making decisions, such as in aquaculture, what your extreme weather response might be, for a processor, when to start lining up their labor force, for fishers, deciding what gear to use, where to go fishing, when to go fishing. And all of those decisions are impacted by the environment and by climate at different spatial and temporal scales. So my work really focuses on better integrating climate information in the form of forecasts or projections into the decisions that are being made to make communities more resilient to climate variability and change. And so I leave you, I think, it's a grand challenge, so being able to maintain ecosystem services and mitigate long-term climate risks to the fishing sector and coastal community, and my work is sort of a little tool that we can add to the toolbox, the main one being the reducing emissions, obviously. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Desiree. I think all of us have had the experience that one of the questions that people ask us right away is how are fisheries responding to all of this? And it's wonderful to hear this perspective on it. So next we're going to hear from Kalani Singh, and he is a native Hawaiian program specialist at Papahana Mokiakea Marine National Monument. So Kalani was born on Hilo, on the Big Island, in Hilo on the Big Island, and was raised in part by his great-grandparents who were traditional medicinal healers who cared for both people and places. And he has become a cultural diplomat, a social environmental justice advocate, and a researcher of social ecological systems with background in Hawaiian studies and marine science. And of course, the National Monument is also a World Heritage Site, and so he focuses on cultural and spiritual significance of this protected area and coordinates with Native Hawaiian-driven initiatives to integrate traditional knowledge systems into the overall management of the monument. Kalani, why don't you tell us about it?
Sure, mahalo nui. I just want to say mahalo to all of you for being here, but especially to the foundation and all of the partners that have supported this event, and just very grateful to be part of it, and just very grateful to be on this panel. This is a Hawaiian proverb, and it says, "A'ohe pau ka ike ka halau ho'okahi," which means that all knowledge is not found in one school. And that's something that I was taught growing up, is that every person has a particular thing to teach you because they are you, or they are you in some form. And so it's this idea of seeing yourself in others and other places as well. In my position, I have this really great opportunity to integrate indigenous knowledge systems, specifically Native Hawaiian knowledge systems. And when I say knowledge systems, it's not just knowledge, but it's also the thing that holds the knowledge. So it might be epistemology, the study of knowledge. It might be different philosophies of pedagogy, how we teach and how we learn. It might be ethics. It might be different things that support the knowledge itself, practices, beliefs. So these are all important components, and we try to integrate them in different ways. Actually, during our staff meetings, we actually do protocol. And what I mean by that is we chant together, we sing a song together before we start our staff meeting. That doesn't happen very often in NOAA. And so it's really, really important for us as managers, as stewards of a World Heritage Site that is mixed, natural and cultural. For us to be able to manage this space for all of those attributes, we have to practice in a way that aligns with place. And so learning about Hawaiian culture is important for all of our staff and all of our partners. And so we learn proverbs, we learn how to chant and things like that. And so, for instance, we had the leadership team from the Office of National Marine Sanctuary come out to Hawaii, and we did an entire welcoming protocol session. And that was really important for us because that's how we welcome people. And so there was chanting, there was acknowledgement of people and place and genealogy, and these are all values that are important to us. Genealogy is really big for us in Hawaii. We think about ourselves as ancestors one day. And so when my son was born, I realized, I'm on this spectrum, and that my son, actually, I was raising him to be an elder of his community. That I didn't receive that knowledge until I had my firstborn son. And that was really powerful for me, to see him as an elder one day. So I had to prepare him to be that elder for his community. At the same time, I'm going to be someone's ancestor. And so what kind of ancestor do I want to be? What kind of ancestor do we want to be? So those are really, really important things. And genealogy, when I hear about Margaret, and all of the people that have contributed, it was because all these people contributed to the success of the monument that it was able to be designated. And it wasn't just conservationists, it wasn't just scientists, but it was cultural advocates, it was educators, it was all types of people, World War veterans, many, many people. And I think for this World Heritage Site, there's a lot of space to hold a lot of values and a lot of meaning for many, many different people and for many, many different reasons. This is the place that I was born and raised. This is Keaukaha. Keaukaha means the passing current. And this was my first classroom. You can see that water is so beautiful, but deceivingly cold. It's freezing. It's because right where we grew up, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa met, and so you have a lot of fresh water funneling into the shore. So there's a lot of mixing happening there. So it's very, very cold water. And if you didn't know that we have snow, but it's becoming less and less, as you probably know why. But this was my first classroom, learning how to be place, learning how to be someone from Hawaii. In our language, when we say we're from Hawaii, we actually say that the place owns us. In a way, we belong to Hawaii. We also say that we are Hawaii, like we are an extension of place. And so it's this idea that humans are a part of the environment. And so that's really, really important. And I don't think we're collectively there yet. When we see the environment damaged, we have to get back to that place where we feel that same hurt, when we feel that same degradation. And I know there's many people that are closely aligned with place, but collectively as humanity, we have to get back to that place again. This is an image of me as a Longline fishery observer from 2010 and 2013. I spent some time on the swordfish and tuna fishing vessels. And this was shocking to me. This was one of my most valuable experiences, this 3-year-long lifestyle, living on these boats for 3 to 6 weeks at a time with crew that were from Vietnam or Indonesia, Kiribati, Korea. So there were language barriers, there were culture barriers. I think I fit in because I was brown like them, but it was really, really interesting. And I remember my first boat, it was shocking to me to see how much fish was coming out of the ocean. Growing up in Keaukaha, we fished not only what you needed, but what the place could provide. We have to remember the reciprocity of that relationship to place. It's not just what you need, but it's also what the place can provide. And so it's that idea that you aloha, but the thing also alohas you back. And so it's reciprocal. And I saw tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish come out of the ocean, and I just wondered, why? Why are we doing this? And it really informed me in what I did next, and I went back to school and got that marine science degree that I wanted because I wanted to make sure that I had the tools from the science fields, and I also could contribute that traditional knowledge that I was raised with. And some of that is ethics, right? Some of that are beliefs and values, not just virtues, but also things that you value, and try to incorporate it in my research. And so at the moment, I'm in the Department of Land and Natural Resources at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'm studying social ecological systems. And one of the things that I'm doing is creating conceptual models that are based on cultural constructs. And I'm going to show you a cultural construct that's based on the geography of Hawaii. And so I'm going to the next slide, please, thank you. And this is the archipelago of Hawaii. And I come from the Big Island, from Hawaii Island. But this is the model for our creation story. The archipelago is the actual framework for the way that we see our Hawaiian universe. I'm gonna build a little bit of that for you and show you, but it has to do with duality. So we can see that on this place. So from the east where the sun rises and the islands are volcanically birthed from the oceanic womb, into the west where the sun sets again and the islands return to their geological source. These are the ideas of life and death in our archipelago. When I show you this line, let's see, yes, it came through. So we reverently refer to this pathway as Keala Polohiwa Kane. So it's the black, dark, glistening, sacred path of Kane, Kane being the patron god of the sun. So does anybody know what this line is? It's the Tropic of Cancer. This is the Tropic of Cancer, and it severs our archipelago into 2 regions. We know that this is the northern advancement of the sun. Yeah, nowhere north of this will you observe the sun directly overhead at zenith. And so what this did for Hawaiians is it divided our universe into night and day. Night and day, yeah? Po being this place where spirits and gods dwell. And you can think about Papahānaumokuākea as being that we identify our gods as taking on natural phenomenon. And that's really important. When you think about natural phenomena as being gods, you are informed differently about your relationship with those things, whether they're birds or whales or islands themselves. But Po means night. In our creation story, this is where life begins. And then eventually man arrives into the story, and it's not until we get into Ao, which means day, that man comes into existence. And we can see that the main Hawaiian Islands, that's the inhabited part of the islands. And what's interesting about this is that we saw a place for man, traditionally, and we saw a place for our akua, our gods. And this informed where we would live and how we would interact with that space. On this pathway, there is an island called Mokumanamana. It's the island of exponential spiritual energy. And it's here that you can observe the sun directly overhead on summer solstice, June 21st of every year. It was actually a pilgrimage that happened every year for about 400 years. And you have the highest concentration of archaeological sites on this island, but no further than that will you see archaeological sites. And why is this? It's because that was not the place for man within Po. So you won't find any archaeological sites within Papahānaumokuākea past Mokumanamana. So the concentration of these sites at Mokumanamana on this pathway was so that we could interact with the space, but not interfere with the space. And so the monument is actually an extension of these old ways that we stewarded or managed place. Yeah, it was indigenous cultures infused all of these principles into their culture so that it was just normal. Yeah, and so I'm using this framework at this 30,000 foot view to look at ways that we create our management plan. Ways that we actually create evaluation plans. When we look at the details of the finer scale of this, we're looking at cultural ecosystem services and the benefits that they provide, which are attributed to values, not just virtues, but other values, that we value islands or people or birds for many different reasons. But looking at it at its smallest component allows us to identify how these things are being impacted at different scales, for different groups, for Native Hawaiians, for other stakeholders. These cultural ecosystem services like heritage, identity, and many, many more. They're very hard to monitor, very hard to define, but if we get down to the smallest level, we can have a better idea of how to monitor and use them to evaluate the effectiveness of our management. So basically using this image to say that we have an opportunity to take these multiple ways of doing things. And in our case, we take these more conventional ways of management and we look at these traditional practices and concepts and we're trying to fuse them together so that we have greater resilience, because we are attributing from different knowledge systems. And so it reinforces what we do and allows the place to be valuable for many different people, for all of us. So with that, I'll just be Pau for now.
Thank you so much. I learned so much. And taking from your proverb, let's look at another school to learn from. And that's the public health realm. And so our next speaker is Surili Patel, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity at the American Public Health Association. And she works on strategic development to bridge the gap between public health programs and sound policy. And she is responsible for some of the signature programs of the organization, including climate change, water safety and security, children's environmental health, tribal health, environmental health messaging, transportation and health, and healthy communities. That's a lot to be responsible for. And she is leading the charge to establish the organization's new Center on Climate Health and Equity. Surili.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. What an honor to be here. I do want to thank the organizers and the foundation again for inviting me and being on this distinguished panel. And I'm excited to talk to you about the health impacts of climate change. Again, I'm Surili Patel, and one of the fun things that public health folks like to say is that we're the first generation to feel the health impacts of climate change and possibly the last generation to do anything about it. And we say this because climate change has these grave, potentially catastrophic health impacts that we're facing today and for generations to come, from heat, stronger summers and longer summers and their related mortalities. We have changing patterns in vector disease. We have flooding, sea level rise, flooding, and its impact on health infrastructure. And we also have water safety, security, access issues. All of these issues will then exacerbate the health impacts in certain communities of color, low-income communities. And something I like to remind everyone is climate change is blind. It's blind to your race, to your income, to your gender, to your zip code, to your age, but it'll impact us all. The difference is how quickly a community can bounce back after a weather event. And some will be just fine. They'll be able to rebuild their roads and their homes, and others will experience lasting impacts for generations to come. And so as a society, it's our responsibility to help those communities especially to come back from those weather events. And I think you all know that it's not enough to come back to that baseline that they were at before, because that no longer is the platform through which they can achieve health or good health. We have to help them build back stronger and more resilient, because those climate events are going to continue to happen, and they need to be able to adapt to and respond to the weather events. And that's where the health equity and the climate justice challenges that we see today come. There are many faces to climate equity, and I'm just going to talk about 4: the young, the old, the poor, and the different. Let's start with the young. Children. They aren't just little people. They consume more water and more air per body weight than adults do. They depend on their adults for care and guardianship. They are they exhibit different behavior patterns, where they're closer to the ground or on the ground, or they're outdoors longer. And they also have developing organ systems and immunology systems. So they're just naturally more susceptible to things like heat-related illnesses, diarrheal diseases, or dehydration. They're more susceptible to the new and re-emerging infectious diseases like Zika. They're also more susceptible to malnutrition when we're talking about having food deserts brought on by climate change. On the opposite end of that age spectrum are our elders. And because of their age, they will experience lower immunities. They may be prone to more injury through falls. And they certainly have a less connection through their lack of mobility to social cohesion. And so that causes a lot of displacement and a lot of leaving behind. Now, the next group I want to talk about are communities of color. And communities of color all have old and young, but they also have an added layer of stress, which is structural racism in this country. This has been going on for generations, mostly because we haven't done much about it, but they're still feeling it. They're also feeling the impacts of degraded infrastructure and the compounded health disparities. Another group is low-income communities. Communities with less resources mean they don't have the capability to pick up and evacuate in a weather event. They won't be able to buy a new home because mine is flooded. And there's also infrastructure issues there too. So I'm saying all this to say that there are a lot of inequities in our communities across the country. And I'd like to offer 3 potential solutions, 3 approaches to equity. The first is procedural equity. And here I'd like to talk about how there is an avenue to engage in the political process and to engage in the decision-making process. So for example, sea level rise is coming up in Florida. Those homes that are on the shore are of higher income family members. They're able to pick up and move inland, rebuild inland. But what's happening inland? Those are communities that have been established there for a while in some cases and can't afford to move. So there's this huge displacement issue happening. Being part of those types of decisions in the communities lends a voice and empowers them. Another example of an equity solution is distributive equity. And this really talks about not just distributing the benefits of a policy or a decision, but it's talking about also equally distributing the risk and the burden. So for example, we're building a stadium in my community. Fantastic, the entire city is gonna gain economic benefits. And my neighbors and I may get a job working for the stadium or the construction. But what's gonna happen to our children who are working downstream from the dust and pollution caused by the construction and the resulting stadium? And last but not least, it's the contextual equity. And this one really looks and acknowledges the fact that the playing field is never gonna be leveled. It never will be, it never has been. But it's really the ability and access to power through the procedural equity options that will then give community members the right to choose, the right and access to be more in control of their distributive outcomes in terms of health. So what is the American Public Health Association doing? Like Dr. Leinen mentioned, we are starting a center on climate, health, and equity. And if I can get help advancing the slide, please. Thank you. And here we are putting our money where our mouth is, where we've been talking about the connection between climate change and health for years. And we're trying to do a few things. We have a few strategies in place. The first is to talk about raising awareness. There is a connection between climate change and health. We want to talk about it. We also want to offer solutions because there's still hope. There's still time for hope. Another thing we want to do is enable a community and an environment where climate-healthy choices are both equitable, but also the easy choice to make. We want to support and promote policies that offer equitable and climate justice and environmental justice solutions and are rooted in those theologies. And last but not least, we want to promote sound science that demystifies the connection between climate change and health. It is impacting our health. It's impacting all of our health. And also offer tested, proven solutions that can be applied at scale. So with that, I want to say thank you, and also thank you for the opportunity to talk about this on World Environmental Health Day. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Surili. Before we go on to the next speaker, I want to remind you that there are some cards on your seats, and we're going to take questions from you after the speakers have finished. So if you want to be writing your question, they'll be picked up, and then we'll share those with the speakers. So next is Colleen Jose, and she is, I love this, a digital strategist and multimedia journalist. She is a visual storyteller and a digital strategist with a background in journalism and technology. And she has award-winning journalistic work in long-form multimedia series, including her coverage of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, climate impacts and legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and I really enjoyed that one, Colleen. And climate impact, and the aftermath of armed conflict in the southern Philippines. And at Adobe, she manages relationships with top artists and agencies while developing programs with digital content team. And before, she was a community editor at Instagram, where she supported editorial programming, product launches, and discovery of global interest-based communities. Colleen.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And it's such an honor to be with all of you here today. Thank you for having us, to be able to share our work, and thank you all for listening. One of the stories that I would like to focus on is climate impacts and the legacy of US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. In this photo here that I made a few years ago, the one that you see of the atoll is of Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands. It's a collection of 29 atolls in the middle of the North Pacific. You would have to really zoom in on Google Maps to see the atolls. It's between Hawaii and Australia. We, along with my colleagues, Kim Wall and Hendrik Kinzel, we reported a series focusing mainly on the impact of sea level rise with the island communities, in addition to excavating the history of US nuclear testing between 1946 and 1958. And what we found there, the locals call the tomb. It's if you just advance here, it's a quick video. I could play that one. It's in the atoll of Enewetak. We journeyed for 4 days on a shipping vessel called the Lady E, the Lady Enewetak, to arrive in this small community of about 500 people. People migrate in and out of Enewetak to visit family. As you would imagine, Enewetak with the nuclear tests, if we could advance, much of it was rendered uninhabitable with, of course, the sea life and all what the locals would call their pantry was in existence after the testing. And so they migrated out, went to Majuro, and now are increasingly coming back to Enewetak to take care of the land and their ancestral home. This is Runit Dome. After the testings, the US Army and some officers put most of the waste into this dome, covered it up in cement, but didn't cover up the bottom. So you could imagine that much of the waste is leaching out into the ocean. Much of the recent reporting now says that it's leaking, but technically there's more contamination in the lagoon than there is in the dome that we know of currently. Much of this research is from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, whom we worked closely with. They were in the sites before us and are continuously doing their studies on the dome and its effects not only on the wildlife, but the contamination in the lagoon. Another important aspect of the community, of course, is the lingering effects of radioactive waste, as well as the lack of opportunity for people and employment. This couple here, they dig for copper, and a lot of the remnants of the nuclear bombs themselves to sell to one Chinese vendor on this island, who then ships it to different parts of Mandurah. And we have heard from multiple people that it ends up in China. So who knows? It could be in our devices or elsewhere. But it's copper that's coming from Enewetak, which came from the nuclear bombs. And this mask I found after Typhoon Bavi in 2015 that washed up on the lagoon. There are a lot of Coke bottles and what you could imagine US Army officers and DOD officers had at the time during the testing. And as Kalani was saying, so much of this isn't just about beyond the science, it's your home as your identity. And so one of the questions we were raising is, what would a nation be without land? Would it have a seat in the United Nations if it were underwater? And part of the ways we communicated that was through multiple publications, and as I showed previously, not just traditional platforms and ways that you communicate, but also social media and going to your community. These are just some clips from Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany with a cross-section of the dome, and The Guardian, most recently in Mashable as well. If we could just advance. We also, in the course of our reporting, followed the reporting through a hashtag called No One's Drowning Baby. It's inspired by the poet, Marshallese environmentalist Kathy Jetnil-Kijner, who has crafted so many beautiful poems about her home and the impacts of climate change in and beyond the Marshall Islands. If you wanted to see more stories from that, another strategy was to partner with different organizations such as Years of Living, the Open Society Foundations, and the International Women's Media Foundation to reach other audiences beyond the ones that were catering to the publications we worked with. And if by any chance you're in Amsterdam, we also have an interactive exhibition on indigenous artifacts, as well as Kathy's poetry, in addition to audio that came from the island, so you could hear from the seashells, with the video and photos that's exhibiting in the Tropen Museum. With that, I'll just leave us to questions. Thank you.
While they're bringing me up some questions, I'll ask one to get us started. And Desiree, can you give us some, you mentioned that your work on climate change and fisheries could lead us to some new management strategies. You want to give us some examples of that?
Yeah, so some of my work has shown that if we actually, into sort of the management decisions that we make, we acknowledge that they are impacted by the environment, then you can actually, for some species where we have enough, of a scientific knowledge of how the environment affects them, you can actually incorporate that knowledge in that decisions. And over the long term, you're going to be able to sort of maintain a higher biomass than if you would not have acknowledged that, and also to maintain long-term, catches for the fisheries in that case. So that's sort of one example.
Great. Several people have asked what your paths were to come to these places. Maybe Surili, why don't you give us
Sure, I'd be happy to. I fell into public health. I was raised Hindu, and one of the teachings that my grandparents and my parents have taught me is do no harm to our environments, and especially do good. Not just don't do anything bad, but do good for our neighbors, our environment, and that those who can do should do. And so naturally, when I was discovering what I wanted to do, public health fell into my lap as an opportunity, and I got started in the emergency preparedness and response area, where I worked on the H1N1 outbreak back in 2009, and then quickly moved to Gustav, which happened the following year, and the response there, and saw the devastation, the environmental health impacts of it, and that's when I came to the dark side of environmental health and climate change, and have been very passionate for it, but also very passionate about the people behind the public health interventions, strategies, and policies that we all work on. And that kind of brings me back home to the way I was raised.
Great. 3 different people have asked how we can make understanding of the ocean, ocean conservation, and the role of the ocean in climate more visible with young people. Anyone want to take that? I'm sort of looking at Colleen because you...
Snapchat.
I
guess the question is, where are young people? And I don't want to say that as a monolithic question, but the platforms where they are and how they consume media is where we theoretically would find them. And our project, as I was saying, our goal was to not just find the audiences who are subscribed to the New York Times or the Guardian, but who are living these moments that they may not have a language for yet, but are certainly impacted by. And I think in just the last few years, so many young people are already advocating beyond my personal experience in doing this, and other experts, that there are opportunities to collaborate with them too. With Kathy's work, I think young is also pretty subjective. We're all pretty young. She's super open to not just sharing her poetry with journalists, but figuring out artistic ways to communicate the sciences in visual communication. So I would encourage finding a collaborator of that young person and the platform that you're most passionate about.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that one?
For us in Hawaii, our young people are really interested in culture, being that we have gaps in knowledge. You know, my parents can't speak Hawaiian, but I've been a beneficiary of the Hawaiian language movement, and my great-grandparents spoke Hawaiian as well. Excuse me. And the way that we communicate science and what's happening is to relate to our oral traditions. And so we talk about how change has occurred and that knowledge is encoded in our chants and our stories, and how it's same but different, and how that's an extension of what's happening now, but we can apply these principles of adaptability and resiliency that we see in our oral traditions to the challenges that we're seeing today with climate change. So that's been a method that we've used in Hawaii.
What about a lot of you are also talking about, I loved your proverb about different schools of knowledge, and you represent different schools of knowledge. One of the big challenges for all of us is, in spite of our 2 wonderful legislators who were here and who are fantastic for the oceans, getting this feeling about the ocean and getting this knowledge of the ocean to people that have to balance other interests, politicians, other kinds of leaders. Do you have any comments about your success in getting that message heard by that particular community? There are a bunch of questions for that.
I can start, but you guys probably have more to say. But I think, for me, I think it's important to start anyways at the grassroots levels and then move it up to, I think then the message will move up to politicians eventually. So I think my work, we try to really engage the stakeholders, being the communities that are fishing, being the communities like First Nations that are impacted, but or even the conservation community, and getting everybody to sit at the table. And in a different, and I think we have some of those processes in fisheries management, like the management councils, but those are very sort of regulated and strict. And so we sort of devised a new workshop where we can engage more to a one-on-one sort of basis, or more on an even basis, and more fair and equitable as well. So I think getting all the voices in a room and finding solutions together, and then hopefully that then translates to some action and from the politicians as well.
I agree. The big movements in Hawaii have always started with grassroots. It's always been from the people, and it's mobilized our state and federal government to really align with those principles and those values for people in place. So we have a huge community-based resource management movement in Hawaii because of that.
There's an interesting public health leader who constantly talks about numbers numb and stories soar. And so I would agree, the grassroots, the individual stories that we could tell that, show how our communities are being impacted, because after all, politicians work for us, and we have to remember that. One of the things the American Public Health Association is doing this summer is a student and early career professional advocacy boot camp that's solely on climate change. So we're bringing in about 200 students to train them on the connection between climate change and health, giving them the tools, get them feeling more comfortable and confident talking about it, and sending them on the Hill to tell their stories. And we're pretty excited about that grassroots type organizing, because I think students and early career professionals are really the ones who are going to be driving this conversation home.
I'm going to go on to Colleen, but before I do, what about mental health? Not just physical health.
Absolutely. Mental health is seen throughout all communities. No matter what income you have, I think income is something, or age, we see children also facing it. There's a strong movement in the public health community to work on psychosocial stressors of climate change. And we're trying to build capacity now so that the communities have the tools and resources and the infrastructure put into place that after a climate event hits, they can deploy. And you don't have to wait for federal assistance. You don't have to wait for state assistance. These community leaders, these advocates within the communities, trusted voices like doctors and nurses, or religious leaders, can lead their community through these psychosocial mental wellness exercises.
Great. Colleen, reaching other communities, whether it's legislators or whatever. Everyone else has said grassroots. What about you?
I was actually going to pick up on grassroots as is fundamental to any type of movement. And I think to deconstruct the hierarchy a little bit more, and to pick up on your note on individual stories, it's beyond language sometimes. And if it were a forum like the COPs or similar types of arenas, from experience, visual communication, for me, has always been what's struck a chord in conversations, that we can rally and gather around a particular topic. Yeah.
Great. I don't know about you, but I am just really much more, we've been talking a lot about optimism through the CHOW, and I'm a lot more optimistic about how things are going to go in the future, listening to this great group of emerging leaders.